careful on your next trip to the woods. You never quite know who will be watching.
I'm on the NC side of the Great Smoky Mountains. Lived here my entire life. All of us here know what's in these woods and mountains. Since the 30s or 40s, there have been feral wild men living in these mountains. They are fast. They will snatch livestock and snatch children. The FBI knows. It's why they do not get involved. I've heard other stories that there was some attempt to kill these feral wild men, but they still exist. Even today. And I'm not talking about some end-of-days extremist who took to the woods. I mean feral, completely wild men, their own language, living underground. We do not go into the woods at night. During the day, we make sure to stay on the trails. Sometimes, you will smell it, that putrid smell. At night, you'll hear them hollering, supposed inbreds. The locals around here know what happened to Dennis Martin. He was snatched by one of the feral wild men. It's not uncommon for people to go missing here. They are normally found, but you'd also be surprised on the number of children that simply disappear. The FBI has covered it up for years. Where do you think the movie The Hills Have Eyes came from? It's true. I hear them from time to time. Disturbing sounds. They live all up and down the mountains here, in national parks and forests. The stories that we all heard growing up about the feral wild men were told to us due to the fact that so many people would go missing in the mountains. Of course, it was a way for our parents to scare us so we would not wander off too far from them or venture into the woods alone. And Dennis Martin was used as an example. My grandfather recalls the newspapers blowing the story up in '69, I believe. The newspapers said one thing, while Tennessee, North Carolina locals said another. The locals said this then, and say this now. There are feral wild men living in these mountains. The government does know that they are here, and they have made attempts to kill them off, but they have not been able to kill them all. Yet, the population now is thought to be minimal. One of these feral wild men abducted Dennis Martin and ate him. This particular feral was spotted by a family in the woods who were in the same vicinity and stated they saw the feral trying to hide from them behind a bush and was hanging a small child from its back like a backpack. The feral was described as being very hairy and tall, wearing only a very torn, dirty shirt. The military came and stayed for a week in the mountains, killing a handful of the feral wild men, including the one who abducted Dennis. Dennis's bones were found by the military, but this was hidden from the family and the papers. And after other assignments into similar incidents, my grandfather claimed to have seen 2 of them in his life. He told me that his first encounter was when he was a child, years before the Martin case, and he and his dad were on a trail in the woods on the Tennessee-North Carolina line when they both approached a dead-end area that bordered a heavy tree line. Just inside the tree line, they saw a wild hillbilly leaning over a deer, eating its insides. The wild hillbilly is what my grandfather said the locals used to call them, long before the media named them anything else. The wild hillbilly was man-like, long hair that was very oily and dirty. The body hair was excessive. The man was bloody, having obviously just killed a deer. My grandfather said that his dad would later say that the hillbilly had a string of the deer guts in his deformed hand. My grandfather has always mentioned the smell being of pure garbage and vomit. They both stopped and walked backwards until they were out of the hillbilly's sight, but said the hillbilly was obviously startled and screamed as if saying,
"Stay the fuck back, this is my deer."
The hillbilly was dragging the deer back, farther into the tree line as my grandfather and his dad backed away. The second sighting is when my grandfather was hunting in '97, and him and his buddy saw a female. They said they were taken back at the obvious sign of breasts, but this one looked more Bigfoot-like. She was running and then suddenly jumped into some hole in the ground and disappeared. They did not go look into it. This is where the underground cave systems come into play. Inside of the mountains and in caves is where all of our wild men, Bigfoot, creatures, are at, and it's why they cannot be found. It is worldwide. Governments know of them. They do not get involved with these creatures unless there is a disappearance and they have to go in and kill, as they did with Dennis Martin. Our governments, admitting to creatures and UFOs, would break down our religious systems. Dealing with the public about these creatures is something that has been avoided for years at all costs. Our caves and mountains cannot be controlled. The underground cave systems are massive, and what's in them is beyond basic human comprehension. To answer some of your other questions in the previous post, yes, the feral wild men are cannibal. They are inbreds. They will often snatch children to eat. Some are raised to reproduce. The geriatric population and the disabled are easy targets for food because it's not expected they will fight back. They also have trapdoors in the woods and doors in the mountains. They will often steal clothing, dig in trash, take pets and farm animals. Though I personally have never seen a feral wild man, I do see evidence of them. The smell also. I have tons of stories of other things I've seen out in these mountains, more demonic. But so far, I have yet to see the feral wild men. I believe, though, only because of the other things I've experienced out here throughout my life. I believe that a lot of the missing 411 cases will not be solved. Kids, hunters, tourists, all missing in the blink of an eye. Everyone always expects reasonable explanations for things because we are still so primitive. Our eyes just are not open to what's really out there. I do not believe much of the population could mentally handle and cope with it if they did know the truth. I believe a feral wild man in the Panamanian jungle was also responsible for the Froon Creamers case. I saw something in 2003 that forever changed my life here in these woods. It affects me today. It wasn't a feral man though, and this is not the sub to discuss it. Point, I'm a believer. Yet I still live here in these woods. If you're a hiker, a hunter, or if you grew up around the mountains, then you know the hold that the mountains and forests can have over you. Such beauty, such fright. So many reached out asking about the feral wild men, wanting more details and information. Here's everything I know. First known sightings in my area of western North Carolina were back in the 1930s or 1940s. They have human qualities, meaning hands, feet, nose, mouth, etc. Some of the human qualities on the hillbillies are often disproportionate. One eye may be larger than the other eye. One hand may be larger than the other one. The scalp and forehead may be enlarged like a tumor. They stand upright, often with a humpback or slightly bent spine. They can just as comfortably get on all fours to hide or navigate. They're hairy, not furry but hairy, and not groomed. They may be the result of bad military experimentation of the mental health population that escaped. They will avoid interactions 99% of the time out of fear of becoming known and being wiped out. The other 1% sightings are either by accident or due to an abduction of a child or older person. Abductions are typically for meals or sacrifice. Cave systems under the United States and all over the world are the homes of our most terrifying monsters. The hillbillies are primitive but smart, so they have underground bunkers and traps all throughout the mountains. Some disappearances in our national parks and forests were due to people falling into traps that led to their bunkers. The government knows they are here, along with Bigfoot, little green trolls, and creatures such as Mothman and the New Jersey Devil, and aliens, of course. The hillbillies will snatch a child right from under his mother, and she will never see a thing. The Dennis Martin case is a perfect example of an abduction from the feral wild men. I received a private message from a very nice gentleman over in Tennessee who shared his story with me about his experiences with the hillbillies. He did not want to share it from his profile publicly in a sub, but he did give me permission to share it. I'll refer to him as Mike. Mike lives near Irwin, Tennessee, along with his wife and their dog. Mike and his wife have had 2 encounters with the feral wild men. One encounter as recent as last week. Mike said the first encounter was back in June of 2019, when he and his wife were both in their living room together watching TV around 8 p.m. They both were startled when they saw a deformed man's face appear in the window. Mike's wife literally yelled out in fright. It stared at them and gave an evil smile and ran off into the woods. They did call the police. Police searched the yard and tree line but found nothing. By 11 p.m., while in bed, Mike and his wife, who couldn't sleep and had the gun nearby, heard disturbing laughing from outside the window. The laugh was a lunatic type of laugh. Mike took his gun and went to the door and out to his porch where he yelled, "Get the hell out of here!" and shot 2 rounds into the ground. Mike saw not 1 but 2 wild men run from behind his shed and into the woods. Mike was so disturbed at the sight of them that he shut and locked the door. He returned to bed with his wife, but they both did not go to sleep. The following morning, Mike's wife routinely lets their dog outside to use the restroom. The dog will do her business, then will always return to the front door and scratch to be let back in. The dog has not been seen again since his wife let her outside that morning. Last week, Mike's wife had a sighting. She was returning home from the supermarket and was unloading groceries from her truck when something up in the trees grabs her attention. She saw a deformed man up in the tree, staring at her and grinning widely. She got back in her truck and left and drove to her husband's office. They both do not know what to do because the police are finding nothing, and they feel like they are not being taken seriously by law enforcement. Mike did install several security cameras. Mike's description of the wild men: taller than 6 foot, thin but toned body, long dark hair on their heads with patches of hair throughout their bodies, pale, grey skin, long fingernails, only 1 tooth in its mouth. Eyes are large and wide, and are black. Looks like a man, Bigfoot, troll mix. Deformed features in the face and head. Mike promises to keep us updated. This story has kept me up at night a time or two. The disappearance of a 6-year-old child alone is frightening. But what's more frightening is what took the child. On Saturday, June 14th, 1969, the Martin family visited the Great Smoky Mountain National Park in Tennessee. The Martin family ran into some campers, also called the Martin family, that also had kids for Dennis and his older brother to play with. Both families allowed the kids to play together, and the kids started a game to hide behind the bushes to surprise the adults. Dennis was last seen by his father, going behind a bush at the tree line as the other kids also hid. Dennis never came out from behind the bush. His father ran 2 miles down the trail looking for his son. He stopped when he knew Dennis could not have gotten that far. Park rangers were then called. Harold Key, a visitor to the park, reported hearing a loud scream on the afternoon Martin disappeared. Shortly after, he claims to have seen a disheveled man, covered in hair and attempting to remain unseen, fleeing through the woods. Key's family elaborated that the figure had a red object slung over his shoulder, matching the clothing Martin was wearing. Despite the report, FBI investigators ultimately dismissed it, given that the sighting had taken place more than 5 miles from where Martin had vanished, and Key was unclear on the timeline. Key later speculated that the man may have been a moonshiner, explaining his reluctance to be seen. One retired park ranger lamented the failure to properly follow up either the footprints or the sighting of the rough-looking man. He argued that as the location of the sighting was downhill from where Martin disappeared, it was more than reasonable for a relatively fit individual to cover that distance in the time frame, even carrying a child. What was this disheveled man covered in hair? The man had the child slung over his shoulder, trying not to be seen. Why didn't the FBI follow up with this sighting? The story gets creepier. Almost 1,500 people searched for Dennis. The Martin family even reached out to psychics for help. On June 23rd, police dogs were brought in, but it was reported that the dogs refused to track that area, only sitting down and whimpering. On the 26th, a man called in to Carson Brewer of the Knoxville News Sentinel and told him to inform the searchers to look around the trees and treetops, stop looking on the ground. This cryptic phone call is another of the strange details surrounding the case that just does not sit right with many. The official search would end on June 29th. Unofficial efforts would continue into September. The Martin family, refusing to believe their son was dead, put up a $5,000 reward for information leading to the return of their son. In their defense, no body, blood, or anything else that might lead to that conclusion was ever found. One thing that cannot be denied is that the government and the military were heavily involved in the search for Dennis Martin, much more so than any other missing persons case I can recall. A fixed wing plane, multiple helicopters, a dozen jeeps, multiple National Guard units, and special forces were called in. Several military command posts were established that seemed to be working independently of the National Park Service and FBI. In the official case report on the incident, it states that President Nixon was monitoring the situation and wanted to be kept up to speed. The sheer scope of the government and military involvement regarding this event was unprecedented. The Green Beret even arrived heavily armed and told the park rangers and many independent searchers to not get involved any longer. Locals state that the Green Beret stayed in those woods for a week. One of the military men involved told a park ranger that we took care of what snatched Dennis. More details from locals who I've spoken with. The stories reported in papers are different from what the locals state. Insight from locals include that the military had knowledge of the feral wild men in the Great Smoky Mountains, and this is why they got involved with the Martin case. While the Green Beret were in those woods, they killed over 30 feral wild men, including the one that snatched Dennis Martin. The military did find the bones and clothes that belonged to Dennis, but it was decided not to inform the family as they could not handle it. The wild man had eaten Dennis, and this had been kept from the family and media for years. This story is one of a kind. Locals do believe a feral wild man abducted Dennis Martin, ate him, and military later came in to kill all the wild men they could find. Reports of feral wild men in the area continue even today. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for joining me again. A huge thank you to Reddit user 007STARZZ for kindly allowing me to use these stories. I hadn't heard any stories like this before, so I jumped on the chance to use them. I hope you enjoyed them. As always, a huge thank you to everyone who continues to support me. I truly do appreciate it so much. And remember,
Papa loves you.